This program is powered by thevirtual.show, making your offline events virtual. Ladies and gentlemen, the host of WEBIT Virtual, Dr. Plamen Russev.
Hello, wonderful WEBIT community. We are still in the geopolitical area of WEBIT, and we are having this theme which embeds all the discussions that we are hosting in front of all of you from all around the world. Thank you so much again for joining, for being with us, and being actively involved in our global community. Only for the past 3 weeks, we have added several thousand more registered users. I think in total it was 9,000 joining our community, which is fantastic in these times when we try to add as much as possible value to all of you, providing you information, providing you access to forward thinkers, and of course, exploring the topics that are of utmost importance currently. Obviously, the geopolitics is something that we are putting special focus during these days, and we all know why. There are so many challenges that arise from all around the world. We've heard a very deep dive into the US point of view with the participation of the Atlantic Council, the US Home Security. We have the father of Internet, Dr. Vint Cerf, sharing his thoughts and vision on where is it heading. Today, I am honored to host 4 fantastic journalists, a phenomenal leading media panel who will go deep dive in the topic and explore with all of us the challenges, the opportunities, and hopefully it will be a positive panel. We will see that. Let me introduce my guests, starting with the first one.
Heinrich is an Israeli journalist and news anchor in New York and a former anchor of the primetime show Crossroads on I-24 News. She is the host of TIJ Talks for the Investigative Journal and a contributor on Quick Hits. In Israel, she produced CNN International and hosted major news shows on Israel's Channel 20, Wawa News and Sport.
Tal, welcome to the WEBIT Virtual Studio. I'm very honored to welcome you and to host you.
So glad to be here with you today, and I'm really thrilled to take part in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Tal. Where are you currently based?
In New York City.
Thank you so much for joining. Allow me to introduce our next 3 guests to the studio before we start our discussion. Here is my second guest.
Rob McKenzie is an editor at Russia Today. After a degree course in aeronautical engineering, Rob McKenzie went on to postgraduate studies in broadcast journalism. He then embarked on a distinguished career working for one of the largest commercial stations in the world.
Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion.
We have fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for being one of them. Allow me to introduce the next 2, and we jump into our discussion.
Benjamin Sutherland is a reporter at The Economist. A defense specialist, he focuses on how advances in military and spycraft technologies are reshaping security landscapes. He edited Modern Warfare, Intelligence and Deterrence, an Economist book on weaponry and conflict that was published in 5 editions, including a Chinese translation.
Ben, thank you for joining. Welcome to WEBIT Virtual.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We look forward to our great panel today and to hear your opinion on all these geopolitics questions that we are going to have on the table. Allow me to have our last guest, and we start. Here is our last panelist.
Ahmed Fathi is managing editor at the American Television News and Global Affairs and economic analyst. He is an American journalist born in Egypt and based at the United Nations, focusing on the undeserved niche of multilingual news production in the official UN languages.
Thank you so much for joining, Ahmed.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be part of this very distinguished panel and in a very timely topic that we need really to address through the crisis we're going through, the pandemic, the COVID-19, the changes in the world, global terrorism, businesses running as usual in some areas, but we have really to focus our energies into trying to explore more future avenues. How can we be better in the future? And I'm excited to be here, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's about positivism and opportunities, hopefully. And we're having the four of you in the studio already. And again, grateful to welcome you all. Tal, you have been covering the crisis for a while from New York, but also putting a focus on Israel, and covering different countries is challenging. Do you see any patterns based on geographies?
Indeed. So I do recognize some trends or similarities, we can say, and some differences between different media outlets and different locations around the world. Specifically, I work, for American audiences, but I also report to Israeli audiences about what's going on with the pandemic right here where I am located in New York. And I think that the differences or the similarities were very much evident, especially in the first days of the outbreak, the first weeks, I should say, both in Israel and in the US. One thing which is very evident, I think, is that media outlets and us journalists, we struggle to find a balance between delivering verified information of what we do know, do our very regular storytelling, sharing information about the story that we do know, information that we did verify as journalists, and speaking about the unknown, reporting about the uncertainty, all the question marks around the pandemic. Because, as journalists, we were used to delivering details and information that we checked. And here you have a situation of a breaking news scenario that is ongoing and constant, and you don't know much. And, as the weeks progress, we just realize that there's so much more that we don't know about the virus. And you need to fill airtime, and you don't want to make too many speculations and too many assumptions, but you find yourself in a situation that in order to keep people more responsible and more informed, you need to tell them and emphasize the element of uncertainty, which is quite weird. Also, I think particularly if I'm talking about the US media, for certain media outlets, and as you know, they either have a liberal or a conservative agenda and have become just like a political players, and in a sense. And we are during an election period right now, election campaign. So there's a question of to what extent should U.S. media outlets, let's say, what's the top objective, let's say, when they report about the pandemic, about the virus? Is it to keep people informed and healthy as much as possible, or is it to promote a certain political agenda and get out the vote? And I can give you some examples for that. I can tell you that in Israel, because unfortunately we're experienced with emergency situations and wars and so on, the media knows how to act as a branch or an arm of the military's home command, meaning delivering information, directives, guidelines to the public. And in that sense, you don't have the political game so much. There is always politics in the media, but so much as I do see here in the United States. And for example, liberal media outlets in the US had this challenge or the struggle between, if you remember, the president, he delivered very long briefings in the first weeks of the pandemic. So it is an election campaign, and they need to make the choice whether to take the full briefing of the president and air it for 1 hour, 2 hours, because on one hand, you want to be able to deliver the information and keep the public informed. That is the president and, the coronavirus task force speaking there. But if you have a certain agenda and you don't want to give President Trump so much exposure, I would say, as a liberal media outlets during an election campaign, because one of your goals is to get out the vote for the Democrats. So there is that struggle. And you feel free to stop me if I'm speaking too much. I have a lot to say about this topic.
No, you have so much to say. But I would like to involve everyone in the discussion. Actually, we can play a very straightforward rules and game. Let's keep it. I know we have so many questions to answer. Let's try to keep the answers within 2 to 3 minutes, so we can have a more let's say a big picture overview. Because really, there are so many things. I would like to have
Dr. Yeah, well, there's one thing I'd like to add to what Tal said, which is very interesting. You referred to growing kind of polarization or partisanship in the media. And I think that part of that is a product of cheaper communications, the internet, globalization in a sense, whereas in the past you had very few TV channels, very few newspapers. They needed to kind of be mainstream, go for a broad audience. And now, in order to distinguish yourself, a media, whether it's a website or an online broadcaster, needs to differentiate itself. And that kind of structurally leads to more partisanship as the media kind of splinters. And we're seeing that effect in politics, definitely.
Thank you so much, Ben. I would like to involve here the other two guests in the discussion. What is your point of view from Egypt, Ahmed?
Well, I left Egypt over 30 years ago, and but interestingly, Tal, in her observation about how the media in the U.S. are handling the Trump campaign. Traditionally, in the US, during campaign seasons, there was distinction between campaign rallies, which is by design, it's meant to stimulate and address the voters, the base of each candidate. But there was always a line on the ground that when you are in the White House as President of the United States, you stick to the business of the United States. Unfortunately, we have seen that evolve into using the airtime into turning it into a campaign event. So that's why I can perfectly agree with many of the networks that decided not to air these briefings and just either provide a summary or do a broadcast when there is the Q&A section, which is open to all journalists. So it is in a way trying to keep things more in line, more down to earth. As far as Egypt, of course, I have many friends who are journalists in Egypt who are now in prison. The added new group that there was large numbers of arrests that took place were doctors. Doctors were writing on the social media about the lack of preparedness, about lack of PPEs, about lack of facilities. And all of a sudden, within less than 24 hours, these doctors have disappeared. Some were arrested. They were all sent into, put under investigation, which is a blank shell case that they just throw everybody in it so they can get over the legal requirement not to extend the temporary incarceration. Some people have been there for 4 years without going to trial. This is just an indication. Going to the United States, where wearing a mask became an extremely political and polarizing issue in many states. Luckily, I live in New York, so I don't have to face this problem as much. But when you see the stations in Florida and California, Texas, I even heard about some people doing, it's crazy, they're doing a COVID house party that you pay like $5. And if you get
crazy,
COVID,
isn't it?
Yeah, this is crazy. So there is, and as Benjamin said, there is more segmentation. We are now infinite number of media outlets. Each person with a cell phone equipped with a camera can broadcast, can express their opinion, and can have followers and people interact with them. We have to get adjusted to this new world, new technology that empowered these people, but also it provided a platform for misinformation. And I will come back to this title of misinformation about COVID in length when my turn comes. Thank you.
Ahmed, thank you for mentioning technology. I would like to jump now to Benjamin. Benjamin, we talk about technology, of course, it comes with advantages and disadvantages. What is the effect of the growing access to information, to the political systems in the past and in the present?
Sure.
So what do you think is the trend that we see here?
Sure. Well, I think that 3 decades ago, with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, there was kind of a euphoria that information was going to lead to more Western-style liberal democracies, because certainly access to information about how life was in the West, or in East German scene, how people lived in West Germany, that kind of thing, played a big role in the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. But there was just too much optimism and kind of blind belief that model would continue forward. And what we're seeing now is that with this profusion of social media and information, I would say that in a sense, it's also making the world more brittle, because along with information and reliable information, you have a lot of falsehoods and half-truths that are being circulated. And when those half-truths or falsehoods really resonate with people's cherished beliefs, they're extremely hard to dislodge. I like to think of a great quote by Jonathan Swift, the 18th century Anglo-Irish writer, who said that falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. And so misinformation is very sticky. It moves quickly. It's hard to dislodge, especially if it resonates with people's cherished beliefs. And there's plenty of politicians who are willing to exploit that to build support.
Back to you, Rob. And we talk about technology. Obviously, technology is, as any tool, could be used for good and for bad. Here we talk about data. We talk about uncertainty. What is your take on that?
I think that what we've seen throughout the whole of this pandemic is that, for instance, the data that we get from each country is completely different. And therefore, unless you have data which is at the same standard, then you can't measure anything. And that's one of the problems which we've got, certainly in America at the moment. It's impossible to measure how many people have got the disease there because they haven't got the data and the quality of the data. And you can't measure that, you can't compare that with any other country. You can't compare it with Britain, you can't compare it with where I am, Greece, because the measuring and the way that the data is collected and the way the data is used is always completely different. And that's one of the issues when we have data collection wherever we are, is that unless you have a standard norm that you can adhere to, then what data you do get will always be suspect. And that is a problem when you come across a pandemic that we've got at the moment. One of the points which Tal mentioned earlier, which I think that I'd like to sort of address, is that you were talking about the sort of the politicization of this of the pandemic in America, and I think that comes partly from the way that the message was given across. And as you quite rightly say at the beginning, we had these very long presidential press conferences, which went on and on and on. And it was the president that was giving the news, as it were. And that's where the basic of the data came from. It was similar in the UK, where the prime minister was doing that sort of thing. I'll take it from my experience here, living in Greece, that wasn't the case. What we had was our daily briefing from the best description is the Greek equivalent of Dr. Fauci. And he, along with a member of the public safety ministry, sort of like the police, would give a daily briefing. And that was it. It wasn't politicized here as it was in other countries. And I think the politicization has also had an effect on the way that people have either accepted the data or not accepted the data, and how we've seen in America where the data has been ignored by a lot of people, and we've seen the spread.
Thank you so much, Rob.
If I can add on top of that.
Yeah, I wanted to address to you and further expand this question. So let's see, what is the main reason of and the objective of the reporting on COVID these days? Is it to keep the people healthy and informed, or it's to continue pushing the regular liberal, conservative, whatever is agenda on the outlet and injecting into the data and the debate that we're having?
Well, since you used the word inject, I think I will talk about this incident. I will give you an example. We all remember President Trump's remarks about injecting, what was it, disinfectants, the idea to experiment with, treatment for COVID through injecting disinfectants to your body. So that is one great example to the question that you present. Because you saw the differences between different media outlets in the US covering this specific remark. Some media outlets that want to make the president sound more ridiculous than usual, they will say, well, President Trump suggests that you drink or inject bleach to fight the virus. But then you have media outlets that maybe put public safety first, and then they felt the urge to Trump-slate. That's the verb that I usually use. And then they wrote headlines like Trump asks about injecting disinfectants, or no, Trump didn't tell Americans to infected with the virus to drink bleach. So, there's this tendency to twist a headline in a way that will better serve your first objective when reporting about the virus. I just want to address something that Rob said before, and I very much agree with the differences between the gathering of the data and the comparison that they do between different countries, because the media is a part of it. Media outlets reporting about the virus in other countries, they often, that's what I found, at least in Israel, they often in the first weeks of the outbreak do it in a way to make the local population sometimes feel better or feel worse about their own situation. And I wonder if you guys are also feeling it where you are, because you come from different countries and you're located in other countries right now during the pandemic. In Israel, for example, I can tell you that my home country did very well with the first wave of the pandemic, but they reported about the situation here in New York in a way that will help the local population in Israel celebrate their achievement, as if, to feel proud about their own accomplishment with the virus. But now Israel, for example, has a second wave, and now they cover the situation in other countries they're more focused about countries that are doing better right now than Israel, to put more pressure on the government. Is that something that you also feel?
Yeah, I would like to hear Ahmed, if possible, because I think in terms of regionalizing, we can walk the world together. Let's start from Egypt.
Based on the details and the information I have, there is no transparency in the number or the impact of the COVID-19 on the Egyptians. I cannot take it very frankly, just at the face value even, that among 100 million inhabitants of Egypt, in extremely crowded urban centers like the capital Cairo, where people literally are on top of each other, that in the entire country you would have like 1,000 cases or 1,200 cases or even 2,000 cases. This is an insult to mathematics, to everything, every rational decision. The other part is, if I try to be the devil's advocate, lack of testing. There is a correlation between the number of tests done, number of cases. The number of cases that need to be hospitalized, that's a different that's a different criteria. But there is no accurate information. There is also a large part, till very recently, they were trying to sell it to the population that it is, it's a hoax, it's a conspiracy. We have from our diet, there are things that can increase our immunity or improve our immune system, which is all unscientific. Authoritarian regimes dealing with information, dealing with data, dealing with current crisis, I will have to double check, triple check, fact check every statement that comes out of these capitals for that. Free media is brilliant, it's great to have it, but it is not a global phenomena yet. We need to have free access to information. Some activists I know have been working for years, including top legal scholars, Egyptian Americans, trying to convince the Egyptian government to adopt freedom of information laws that is non-existent, to get simple statistics about, say, the number of males and females over the age of 30 in an urban center in Cairo. You have to file, and this is for just marketing a consumer product or something. You have to file an application with a government authority. You have to file an application with the General Intelligence Service. You have to file application with the cabinet. It's a tedious process. I believe, Dr. Russev, you probably have gone through that in your own country back in the days when it was still behind the Iron Curtain. I'm sure with all of us, I see that we have lots of Middle East, Europe experience, that it is clear the best approach with the COVID-19, that it was not supposed to be politicized. This was a huge mistake. It was supposed to be dealt with within the framework and foundations of public health. It is supposed to be taken care of by scientists and physicians, and not by politicians. And this is what Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York exactly did. And that's why you can see where New York State is and where Florida is. These things we have really not to discount from our analysis, because we will continuously face the challenge of the lack of information. When we further get into the data part, we can be resilient as planet and as people, empowered by data.
Thank you very much. I would like to put this this question particularly now to Benjamin, but feel free to join in, because already Tal and Ahmed, we were discussing about misinformation, disinformation, lack of information, or we are flooded with some information. We don't know how much of real information is there, real data is there. So Benjamin, what is your take on that? Normally networks are about, I mean, that's the reason to have a network, to provide information in the best case scenario. obviously it's not the case. So what's your take on that? Where do we go next?
One thing I would say is that when you have an omnipresent flood of real-time information from myriad sources, hundreds of thousands or millions of people or different channels, I call them, one consequence is you lose some historical perspective. And the immediate becomes more real, and that can cause problems, and you see it can move mobs dramatically in certain places. This has happened in Pakistan, among other places, where mobs get motivated against what they consider to be blasphemy, and someone gets lynched physically. But we're also seeing that in the West too, where mobs are getting motivated by perceived transgressions against what's politically correct. People are losing their jobs, their reputation. And I think that's connected to this, what I referred to earlier as kind of these data networks can make the planet more brittle, not just more resilient. Obviously, there's ways to use technology and information networks to create resilience, but it's not. It requires wisdom and political will. It's not a natural consequence of the technology.
Wisdom. What a word. I think one of the things that we're missing these days in all the verticals, wherever we see the challenges, it's the wisdom word is kind of needed. And if I go to Tal, why do so many Americans distrust the media? Is it because of the lack of wisdom? What is how did US get to that?
So we mentioned it before. I think it's the partisanship. What I feel here as an Israeli journalist, I consider myself to be a foreign journalist. I've been in the US for 3 years now, but what I need to do in order to try to realize what's the real story, let's say there's a certain incident, I need to watch CNN, I need to watch Fox News, I need to follow CBS News, and then I need to go online and check on Twitter. I can tell you, Dr. Russev, that one media outlet, one or even two, it's just not enough. The reality is distorted in a way to fit a political agenda. Mainstream media channels in the US, and I say, so sadly, do not present an on-air dialogue. And I'm actually proud that in my home country, Israel, this trend has started to change in recent years. And what you see, I mean, we have a lot of political issues. We've had a 3 election cycle in 1 year, but right now you see a unity government in Israel. You see a wide public consensus over top issues. Here, the society is just getting more extreme. And I say here in terms of the US, because in the prime time, you have mainly, the highly watched shows are mainly opinion shows. And I'm not saying it's bad. And I just wish that there would have been more dialogue on these shows. And it in a sense, it's just like in universities. I think it made society become more extreme. People are not tolerant to listening to other opinions. Benjamin mentioned it. We see journalists now, just either retiring or journalists leaving the New York Times, for example, over this exact issue. Barry Weiss, a very prominent journalist of the New York Times, she just announced she's leaving yesterday over the lack of opinion. And when we talk about the
lack of diversity of opinion.
Lack of diversity of opinion, to be accurate.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the social media, for example, then it's very true that sometimes you have a lot of misinformation on social media, but sometimes you go on social media and you notice the gap between the stories that they're telling you on certain channels and what people are really telling you on the ground happening. Because sometimes the channels, they report a certain story, but they take out the context. They don't tell you, for example, if we're talking about, race issues or privilege, all of these terms have become more prevalent, much more prevalent. There's a huge increase in reports about these issues in recent years, or more particularly in 2020, but they leave out the context. And agree with me, I guess you can agree with me, if I'm reporting about, let's say, a giraffe walking freely, there's a difference if the giraffe is walking freely at the zoo, on a main street, or in a planet full of giraffes, So
I love this. All right, fantastic. Yeah, that's what the difference, isn't it? It's the same. Like, is the bottle fully empty or half empty or half full? Right? It's
true.
It's. But Tal, if you allow me, I would like to bring Rob here to discussion. Rob, we talk about first some wisdom issues. We're there, we see it. At the same time, lack of trust, which comes from the fact that sometimes you read and you see and you watch things that are not true. Let's say it like this. But there is so small to say when it comes to truthful information. The information is so imprecise that sometimes journalists have no other way but just to present what they know, especially I'm talking about COVID now. And the type of information sets are kind of impossible to compare, and you can skew them in a way that you cannot really make take the essence. So what is your take on this? Where do you see this heading?
I'm going to sort of answer you in a sort of very roundabout way, because one of the issues, I think, is if you look at mainstream media, it's the sort of people who are journalists. And I remember when I went to journalism college, the majority of people who were there to be journalists were English graduates. They knew English, but they didn't know things like science. And that, I think, is one of the keys, is that the journalists will write a story, but they won't know whether the science that they're writing about, the data that they're writing about, is accurate or not. I can tell you a story about, which is not COVID related, but was something which I sort of came across years ago when I first started working in Russia, and we were doing a look at some of the magazines, and one of the well-respected Russian magazines was talking about the number of children who died in playground accidents, and they were saying 1,000 children a year died in playground accidents in Russia. And my ears and my senses, 1,000 children. How can this be? And I checked with, the translators. Yes, that's what it says. And I said, I can't believe this. So I went and looked at the data for America, which has 3 times the population. And they had a total number of playground accidents where children died in a year, 15. So, until I actually questioned the data, nobody was going to sort of say, hang on a second, this doesn't sound right. That's because I have a technical background. I studied engineering before I became a journalist. And I think that's one of the issues you have throughout the whole of the COVID-19, debacle is that we have too few journalists who have the technical background to question when the data doesn't mount up correctly, when the figures don't make sense, or when they do make sense, actually stressing the point that this is how it really is, and it's not fake, it's how it is.
I totally agree with Rob on his view that for journalists, it's always better to have a technical background. You cannot just be a linguist, you cannot just be a talent, on-air talent. It's a way of structuring the mindset or shaping the mindset of the journalist. When you're submitted with numbers, you don't need to go into a complicated statistical analysis for the data, but you just need to exercise some common sense. Some data at face value might be looks legitimate, but if you just think about it a little bit, apply some critical analysis to it, it turns out to be a fake or inaccurate at the best. So definitely journalists should have another background, preferably a technical one.
Ahmed, can you give specific examples of things that you have seen and you find like outrageous and impossible to be redistributed as usually happens?
I covered the UN for the past 10 years. 90% of my work is UN based. When they launched in 2015 the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I remember during that time, and everybody was excited, and this is a consensus, unanimous adoption by 193 member states, etc. I said, goals are very ambitious. I like them, I support them. But how are we going to measure where we are? Because 10 years before, 15 years ago before, there was what we called Millennium Development Goals, not relate to the data presented. This is on a member state level. I just gave an example, my own agonizing, with the fact that among 100 million population of Egypt, when there was only like 2,000 people tested positive, it's either you're not doing testing or you're not giving us the correct number. So it goes both ways in this regard.
All right. Thank you, Ahmed. I would like to address here Benjamin, and because we don't have much time left, Benjamin, we had talk about high-tech liberalism, and what about the second nuclear age? These two topics are quite broad. Can you elaborate on the first one to start with?
Sure.
How is this high-tech liberalism happening?
Yeah. So essentially, it's a whole other aspect to the social media kind of environment and the technology that we have. Again, it can be used with wisdom for greater societal resilience against shocks, but at the same time, it can also, and it is being misused by plenty of illiberal regimes to find dissidents, find political opponents, document what they're doing, track them, and prosecute them, or otherwise, put them in prison or get rid of them. So that's a whole nother aspect to this kind of technological universe and what we've been talking about. As far as the second nuclear age, this is kind of moving the topic in a slightly different direction. But as access to information, knowledge, science, nuclear science and physics specifically spreads, it's accelerating what some scholars call the second nuclear age, with the first one being the nuclear standoff between essentially the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in which the nuclear arsenals were essentially used to maintain the status quo. Now what we're seeing with the second nuclear age is challenger powers developing or potentially developing or getting ready to develop nuclear arsenals, and but for a very different purpose, which is to challenge or contest the established order, and so that's very troubling. So I'm definitely not an optimist with this notion that technology is going to save us.
All right, but because we are almost wrapping up, and because I am myself pronoic, I believe in the good conspiracy for the good of the humankind. I would like to suggest here a counter point of view. if we say a second nuclear age. Let's not forget that nuclear actually brought peace because of the fact that it was so destructive. No one dared, at the end of the day, with exception, to use the red button, and that's why it was called. It was like the Iron Curtain or whatever. But at the end of the day, there was peace. Now the question is, if the data becomes the nuclear, do you think that because of data and because of AI, we can still count on the peace in the future?
The question, can we still count on peace due to, what did you mean by the data? Just the data environment, information channels?
Yeah, I mean that because Benjamin has you leverage the nuke power to the data and technology now. If we see the technology as a driver of the new, and currently it is, of the today and tomorrow, the new dream world that we create, do you think that it's exactly the technology can play the same role as the nuclear was playing in the past and still protect the peace if we have all the parties equally developed?
Yeah, I guess I don't see that happening. I think that globalization in general and the spread of technology and information, what it does is it empowers people and groups asymmetrically. There's certainly nothing wrong with that in itself, but we have a lot of different groups and regimes and countries with very different value systems about human rights and what's right and what's wrong, and ways of viewing their interests. And so no, I don't think we're going to, there's any kind of analog here where you've got the so-called nuclear peace standoff. No one's going to do anything because the enemy has nuclear weapons. I don't see that transferring to the spread of how technology could create peace. I think the opposite is happening.
Well, thank you. I will take the opportunity to request Tal and Rob and Ahmed for some final words.
Well, I will start because you've been talking about nukes, and as an Israeli, I think, I mean, having a potentially nuclear capable Iran is our top concern for Israelis. I'm not a cyber expert, but I do know that there's a lot going on right now between Israel and Iran. For example, there are a lot of mystery blasts appearing in Iran. Some media outlets say that Israel might be the force behind some of them. So that is really fascinating to follow. But yeah, I am very worried about Iran being able to eventually develop and have nukes, and I am worried about the U.S. presidential election in that sense, because Joe Biden has already said that he will take the U.S. Back into the Iran nuclear deal and basically give Iran and its proxies a new lifeline. So that does concern me as an Israeli.
And keep in mind that you don't need to detonate a nuclear weapon to use it. Once you have a nuclear weapon, you are in a sense using it because you have the
deterrence
inherent in the weapon. You don't need to detonate a weapon to use it.
True.
I hear you. Ahmed?
If we're speaking about weapons of mass destruction, my position is solid. I am against nuclear, chemical, biological weapons of any use, experimenting. I think the world can be definitely on in a better place and on a better track if they disarm with these three types of weapons. However, being realist, I think we need to have more of a governance system, a multilateral approach. The only organization or the only gathering of this sort is the United Nations, the intergovernmental organization that have 193 countries on the world. Agendas can contradict, but at least they keep on talking. I think it's better, and coming from the Middle East, talking is better than fighting. Well, the weather is too hot. Some people just can't take it and things get out of action. But joking aside, technology is my number one interest. I think it's great. It's empowering. It empowered us as first-hand user, as a consumer. Empowered me through the years, through my career, my life, everything. But we need to be extremely careful dealing with new areas like artificial intelligence, especially in militarization of
but let me, Ahmed, let me interject here. I think a lot of people would agree that it would be great if we could get rid of chemical weapons and biological weapons and so forth. But I guess I don't see any possibility for all the regimes in the world to come together and be in agreement on that. I mean, a lot of people would say you shouldn't bomb hospitals, and we've seen repeated bombing of hospitals and clinics by Russian forces in
and
Syria.
we've seen terrorists using hospitals as shields.
Yeah, and so for however much we want that, the United Nations is not in any position to impose that or prevent that from happening.
The United Nations is not a standalone from the rest of the countries of the world. The United Nations represents the will of the 193 members. Of course, there is
right, and the will of some of those governments, and the will of some of those governments is to put people in gulags and bomb hospitals and do ethnic cleansing. You're right. It's the individual governments, but they have very different value sets and very different sets of interests.
I have tried to lead you to a positive wrapping up, but I
can go back to my giraffe story to wrap it up with the giraffe story.
Yes, that's the giraffe story. And I'm very grateful for the four of you for sharing your vision, your also thought leadership, and definitely your voices are quite loud heard around the world. And having you with us, having you with our community adds definitely value, regardless if positive or negative. We all know that it's only the well-prepared that survive. So let's make sure that we prepare our community, our friends, and the humankind for this obviously challenging times ahead of us. And we're not talking about survival, but definitely talking about making the most of protecting the humankind and definitely our survival. Because as we can see from this COVID crisis, at the moment the humans stop doing what they're doing, their impact over the nature immediately regenerates. So here it's not about the planet, it is about us, the humans. So again, a huge thank you to all of you, and very grateful for being with us. I look forward to welcome you again to WEBIT Virtual and to our wonderful community. I will see you again next week. Thank you all for joining.
This program is powered by thevirtual.show, making your offline events virtual.